by injecting uncertainty. I think, frankly, the timeline may be more like the middle of July. And it's my hope, Mr. President, that the senators from Colorado will be joined by senators from both sides of this body and both sides of this Capitol in crafting a responsible bipartisan solution.
The senator, in effect, is saying that rather than this being a problem, although it is, this is an enormous opportunity for the country to chart a new course. And if we agree to do it first and foremost as Americans, not as Democrats.
The senators have spoken collectively for 30 minutes.
We thank the chair for that notification. We look forward to next week continuing this conversation, Mr. President. I want to thank my colleague from Delaware for joining myself and Senator Bennett in this discussion here this afternoon.
I'd like to express, Mr. President, my gratitude to the senators from Colorado for allowing me to join them and look forward to continuing this conversation further.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, in waiting to speak, I've had the opportunity to listen to my colleagues from across the aisle speak, and while my purpose here is to speak on another subject, I do want to say that what we have just heard over the last 30-some minutes from 3 Democrat senators, and I think others are planning to speak also. Prior to that, what was heard from a number of Republicans regarding the necessity to address this serious issue of debt and deficit and how we're going to proceed to try to deal with this question before we run into a situation of national default with consequences we can't begin to imagine. I think it's appropriate to say that there is bipartisan support for serious debate and discussion. I was disappointed, obviously. In fact, I was more than disappointed. I was very frustrated yesterday with the President's press conference when he essentially said that Congress is not doing its job and that comparing to what was being done here was like raising children, undisciplined children that couldn't do their homework. Well, he not only was targeting the opposition, in which sounded like a lot of campaign rhetoric, and of course all this is very disappointing at a time when we shouldn't even be thinking about the election of 2012 and focusing on any kind of campaign rhetoric. We ought to be thinking and working to address the crisis before us that is now, that is going to have implications for every American now. And if we don't come to an agreement on how to proceed before August 2nd, we're going to see how the financial markets react to what we have not been able to do. But to suggest that we haven't been doing anything and that the Congress needs to take the lead, I think goes even against the President's own thoughts when he was a member of this body. But I want to just quote from a statement that he made when President Obama was Senator Obama. And that quote states the following: "The fact that we are here today to debate raising America's debt limit is a sign of leadership failure. Increasing America's debt weakens us domestically and internationally. Leadership means that the buck stops here. Instead, Washington is shifting the burden of bad choices today onto the backs of our children and grandchildren. America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership. Americans deserve better." Yes, Americans do deserve better. But obviously that famous sign that used to be on the desk of Harry Truman when he was president, "The buck stops here," has been taken off that presidential desk and shifted over to the responsibility of the Congress. And we do have a responsibility. But it's fair to say and accurate to say that without presidential leadership, no matter what we do here, will not become law and will not become effective, because the President needs to be engaged in supporting what we do, otherwise it won't become law. Now, I think most of the American public, based on the inferences that were made yesterday by the President in his press conference, think that Republicans are on one side and Democrats are on another side, and they don't see the problem the same way. Well, I think what we just heard here is that eloquent speeches and important speeches from both Republicans and now just Democrats indicate that there are adults here, not just children, that we have been working hard ever since day one of this session to try to address a train wreck that we see coming. First, it was estimated to come on May 16th, and now August 2nd. Bought a little bit of time, I guess. But the clock is ticking, and we see a train wreck coming, and we're trying to do something about it. And there are serious people making serious efforts to have serious dialogue and debate as to how we best go forward in the interest of our country and not in the interest of the 2012 election. In the interest of our grandchildren and children, and not in the interest of our political careers. I came back to the Senate for one reason and one reason only, and that I was not going to stand idly by and watch this country, because our generation, my generation, be the first generation to hand our children a debt and deficit, problems that they probably could never, a hole they could never dig out of. And they could not enjoy all the benefits that my generation has had through peace and prosperity that we have enjoyed. It is clear, and I'm not here to go through all the statistics. I've made several speeches on this topic, and we hear this on the floor every day. There are so many facts in support of the need to take serious efforts to address this serious problem. There's so much handwriting in the wall's about to collapse. Economists from the conservative side to the liberal side and everybody in between, analysts, others, financial markets and so forth, are taking action and saying that we need here to take action. We see governors, Democrats and Republicans across this country in various states taking actions that need to be taken. I'm proud of what we've done in the state of Indiana in the last 6 years under the leadership of Governor Daniels. We have balanced our budget. We have dug out from a deep deficit left by his predecessor. We have AAA credit rating. We made some tough choices. We've had to cut and slash government jobs. Interestingly enough, Hoosiers really aren't exactly sure what we're missing. There was a lot of bloat and a lot of excess there. But we've made tough choices, and we've paid a financial price for it. But we're in better shape today than we've been maybe in a long, long time as a result of taking these actions. And we see countries around the world having to belly up to the facts, the reality of the fact that they've overspent, overpromised, and have a state that has promised more than it can deliver. And yet the United States of America, which should be the leader of this effort in terms of getting its economy in shape, it's a place where the dollar was sound and the place to invest your money anywhere in the world and know it was the safest place. All that's now become in question. And I've been part of these talks across the aisle. The two senators from Colorado who just spoke, the senator from Delaware who just spoke, and others are taking this seriously. They're not putting their political fortunes ahead of the necessity to deal with these issues. They are saying that more important, what transcends politics, what transcends re-election, is the fact that we have a serious crisis that has to be dealt with now, and tough choices have to be made. And we're talking in earnest, behind closed doors, working in open sessions and closed sessions, trying to fashion an appropriate response. But without the President's leadership, no matter what we do, no matter what package we put together, we cannot succeed. And so it appears that the President has decided to engage in politics. The 2012 elections, it's very disappointing. I hope that's not the case. I hope this shift that we have seen here from needing to get involved to what's wrong with you guys and women is just a temporary lapse. Now, you know, when you get frustrated, it's easy to say childish things. And that's why I waited overnight, so I wouldn't come down here to be characterized as someone who says childish things. Our problems that we face are too serious for us not to take it seriously. I, too, believe we can fashion a plan that is in the best interest of the American people and the future of America. But we can't do it by pointing fingers at each other, and we can't do it without presidential leadership. And right now, the one missing element is presidential leadership. As has been said before, the President was invited to come and meet with us today and to talk to us about the seriousness of this issue. We were willing to demonstrate to him that our doors are open and we're willing to go there. But it takes a commitment on both sides in order to accomplish that. Instead, I guess a couple of fundraisers are scheduled, one in Philadelphia and one in Las Vegas, and apparently that takes precedence. So I think the President's words are pretty hollow. Mr. President, I came down here to talk about another issue, and I'd like to do that now. Our necessary focus on the economic situation and what we need to do and the impending debt crisis that we're facing should take precedence here, but we can't overlook the fact that we have serious issues on an international level that will have an impact on our country in the future. And those of us that are here have the responsibility not only to deal with our fiscal issues and domestic issues, but with international and security and foreign policy issues. I'd hoped to speak tomorrow on this because it's the first anniversary of the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act that was passed by an overwhelming majority, bipartisan majority, in the last Congress. In fact, the vote in the Senate here was 99-0. This act expanded sanctions on the Iranian regime as it continues its quest for nuclear weapons capability. Clearly, more needs to be done, and I was here to talk about that and the implications of that. But I needed to say something about what's happened here in the previous 24 hours that's been so disconcerting to not only to me but to the American people, and I think to both Republicans and Democrats who are trying to take a serious effort at the problems that we face. Put on the back burner because of all this discussion is this question about Iran and where it's going and what its future it's headed toward and what the Middle East and the consequences of that future of a nuclear-armed Iran will be. This month, my colleagues and I, because we feel that these sanctions have not yet accomplished the goal that we have intended, that this needs to be even tougher sanctions against Iran, we've introduced the bill, the Iran, North Korea, and Syria Sanctions Consolidation Act of 2011, that further tightens the noose on the Iranian regime. We need strong support from this body and collective efforts to prevent a nuclear Iran. And to explain why I believe this work is of such dramatic, urgent, and growing importance to our nation, I would like to take just a few minutes to do so. The enormous changes that are being wrought by the Arab Spring, all this uprising taking place in the Middle East, and the potential consequences, both positive and negative, of that movement have captured our attention. Those of us who care passionately about the future of the Middle East and understand the consequences to our national security as a consequence of that, whether it's economic security because of energy resources we get from the Middle East, or whether it's diplomatic security or just national security in terms of conflict that potentially draws us into that effort, all of this is at stake. But we're hoping, of course, that the democratic instincts of the Arab Spring will develop. But we look at this with a mixture of both hope and concern. The democratic impulse in the region has not yet brought meaningful change to the Iranian people, who continue to suffer under an autocratic, savage, and ruthless regime. As that regime continues to crush every plea for greater democratic liberties, it also pursues its vision of nuclear weapons capability. Welcome signs of democratic progress elsewhere in the region must not deflect our attention from the growing danger in Iran. 3 American presidents, including this current president, have declared that a nuclear weapons-capable Iran is unacceptable. To give meaning to that repeated commitment to do whatever is necessary to prevent Iran from gaining that dangerous capability remains an urgent and highly significant matter facing the United States and international security. The consequences of a nuclear Iran or a nuclear weapons-capable Iran are not tolerable, not acceptable, and need to motivate the most powerful and effective efforts possible to prevent that from happening. A nuclear-armed Iran would threaten the entire region and its enormous energy resources. It would motivate broad nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East. It would further destabilize a region already in turmoil. It would encourage radicalism and terrorism, and it would threaten the destruction of the State of Israel. This last danger alone, the potential destruction, the declared destruction of the nation of Israel, that alone potentially raises the danger to which Israel, as a last resort, would almost certainly have to respond to ensure its survival. That alone compels us to be clear-eyed and determined to find a solution before we have to face that potential decision. I've been working in recent years with the Bipartisan Policy Center to press for a robust, comprehensive three-track effort to raise the stakes on the Iranian regime and to compel it to live up to its commitments and halt its weapons program. The first track we proposed was enhanced diplomatic efforts. People say, well, why diplomatic efforts? I mean, that just is going nowhere. Look, we felt we needed to enhance those efforts to at least give that a chance so that those who would say sanctions should not be imposed until you try diplomatic efforts, let's say, okay, let's continue to give that a shot, but let's do that in parallel with some of these other approaches. But this enhanced diplomatic effort, where we create and invigorate and motivate an international coalition devoted to the same objective, to prevent Iran from gaining nuclear weapons, has been tried, and it has not succeeded. Now, this effort doesn't mean simply repeated outreaches to the Iranian regime to engage them in dialogue. The Obama administration came into office promising such discussions, but this has gone nowhere. International talks in Geneva last year accomplished nothing. Talks in Turkey earlier this year broke down in the afternoon of the very first day. Clearly, lack of any flexibility and goodwill on behalf of the Iranian regime has dissuaded any further attempt to renew dialogue efforts. Dialogue with the Iranians is in a deep...
The Senator has used his 10 minutes.
Mr. President, I wasn't aware that I had asked for 10 minutes.
The order is for 10 minutes. Senators consume more than 15 minutes.
That's news to me. I would ask unanimous consent for an additional 5 minutes.
Is there objection? The objection is ordered.
Mr. President, I'm just trying to see here how I can wrap this up. I'll check with the desk next time I speak to make sure I understand what the current rules are here. I might ask, Mr. President, is there an order in place that I'm not aware of? That's probably...
The order is that we are in morning business with 10 minutes to be consumed by each senator.
All right. I apologize, Mr. President. I didn't...
Although consent has been given for larger blocks of time, and the senator has just been given consent.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Well, as I said, the second track for solutions are sanctions. We currently have Sanction Act in place. We want to impose an additional sanction track. That's why I have sponsored and co-sponsored this new act. The impact of this, I think, could potentially be significant, but so far we have not seen success as a result of sanctions. Since the international community first began to face this challenge in the form of IAEA inspections and reports, various U.S. Security Council sanctions and resolutions, and protracted negotiations to construct an effective coalition strong enough to have meaning, none of these actions have seriously thwarted the Iranian regime's nuclear ambitions. That takes us to the third track of a comprehensive approach. And those of us, the Bipartisan Policy Commission, in terms of and working with experts on all sides of this issue, came to the conclusion that certain military options can be put in place that will serve serious and open discussion, deserve serious and open discussion. And diplomacy and sanctions, since they have proven too weak, we need an extra kick to this process in order to achieve the desired result. I'm suggesting discussion and debate and dialogue. No one should suppose that including a military option in this package means anything other than preparing the ground for the logical, necessary access to measures of last resort, should they be needed. Through the Bipartisan Policy Center, we participated in an exhaustive analysis of all the means and consequences of potential military action against Iran's nuclear weapons program. There were no war advocates in that room, none of us. Nevertheless, if it's true that a nuclear weapons-capable Iran is unacceptable, then our nation and the international community as a whole must see with vivid clarity what measures remain should the first two tracks fail. And the Iranian regime must be especially clear-eyed and non-delusional about those potential consequences should it not change its behavior. Indeed, to give the diplomatic and sanctions tracks the essential credibility they require, the military option must be entirely believable, in fact, inevitable. Military options themselves include a multi-pronged, comprehensive strategy, not all of which are kinetic or mean an actual attack with armed forces. Such a strategy would include constructing the alliances needed to station U.S. forces in position to confront Iran, and then a series of steps designed to demonstrate to Iran that the United States and its coalition partners are capable of decisive military action, if necessary, to stop its nuclear program. At the end of the day, we have to decide whether or not we will tolerate an Iran with nuclear weapons. If other states, including, importantly, China and Russia, really become convinced of this core reality, they will make different calculations about their own self-interest in this matter. If they come to believe that we so desperately need them to accept modest sanctions on Iran, then they can compel us to take off the table the sanction proposals with real teeth. We have become hostage to their views in this vital issue and also to their related economic interests. So if these and other states come to realize that, when we say unacceptable, we mean it, they will come to different conclusions about how their own interests can be best served. In conclusion, Mr. President, a nuclear weapons-capable Iran that we believe can be contained is not one that we're therefore prepared to tolerate. If we think that we can solve this problem through diplomatic efforts and sanctions, we have not been able to do so, and the likelihood of doing so diminishes as every day goes by, and the nuclear clock keeps ticking in Iran. This is an illusion and one that makes our task much harder. If others, however, especially Iran, but also including our allies and other coalition partners, come to believe that we would consider tolerating a nuclear Iran because it can somehow be contained, then none of this will work. The result then will not be a contained and tolerated nuclear Iran. It will be the military's action we all hope to avoid, whether it is ours or another's. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. I came to the floor this afternoon to lend my voice to the others who have been here, of my colleagues, to talk about the need to come to the table and come up with an agreement around how we're going to deal with raising the debt limit by the August 2nd deadline and include some sort of package to address our debt and our deficits. And I listened carefully to my colleague and friend from Indiana, and I think we agree on a lot of what he said. I certainly agree that both sides of the aisle have been working hard to look at ways that we can address this issue, and I agree that we need presidential leadership to address this challenge we're facing. That's why I was so pleased to see the President come out yesterday and say very strongly that in order to address this, we're going to have to put revenues on the table, make sure they're in the mix, because we can't get there without looking at revenues, with just looking at cuts to the budget. So I think there is a lot of agreement, but every negotiation that I've been part of means that every side has to give a little. And so drawing a line in the sand and saying we're not going to look at revenues at the same time we're looking at spending cuts is not the way for us to solve this challenge. Now, we all know that negotiations are ongoing between the President and between the leadership in both the House and Senate. They're looking at all kinds of measures to reduce the deficit and raise the legal debt limit. And there's no doubt that we have to address the long-term debt and deficits. And I've repeatedly called for a bipartisan package that includes reforms to everything that's deficit-related. So that means domestic, defense, and mandatory spending, as well as looking at revenues. And I support including deficit reduction measures in the vote to raise the debt limit. I believe that reducing the deficit is important to strengthening the long-term health of our economy. But that being said, failure to increase the debt limit would do exactly the opposite. It would devastate the economy. To be clear, raising the debt limit does not mean spending more. It means meeting our existing obligations, obligations made by both parties over many years. Failure to raise the debt limit means default. It means for the first time in the history of the United States of America, we would not pay our creditors. And that disruption would cause the worldwide economy to have devastating consequences, consequences that would be incredibly expensive to American taxpayers. Warren Buffett, I think, said it very well when he said that Congress, if it did that, it would be the most asinine act ever. Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke said it would cause severe disruptions in the financial markets. It would slow our recovery, and it would make the deficit problem worse. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce says it absolutely must be done. The debt limit must be raised. Economist and former Reagan advisor Larry Kudlow said default would be, quote, catastrophic. All of these experts have pointed out that the disruption to world financial markets would plunge us into another financial crisis, and America would lose the trust of world investors, which would result in higher borrowing costs for the government, and that would ultimately be borne by taxpayers. It would also mean higher interest rates for consumers, making it more expensive to buy a house, pay for college, or even pay your credit card bill. And in a recent report, the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service estimated that if we don't raise the debt limit, the federal government would have to eliminate all spending on discretionary programs, cut nearly 70% of spending for programs like Social Security and Medicare, or increase taxes by more than 60%. That's not just speculation. That is what will happen if we fail to raise the debt limit. We should not be playing politics with this issue. We all have a stake in making sure this gets done. And that's why it makes no sense to me that the leadership from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are refusing to entertain any discussion about eliminating any tax loopholes. I think it's important to highlight some of those tax loopholes, and there are two that I want to talk about that have been mentioned on the floor in the last couple of days. And I would think that we could all agree that these are the kind of tax loopholes that we ought to be closing. First, we have a special deduction for yacht owners. And if the yacht is big enough, like this picture of this yacht, so if it has beds and a bathroom and a kitchen, then yacht owners can claim it as a second home, and they can get the same mortgage interest deduction on their taxes that we give to middle-class homeowners. I think this is a clear abuse of the tax code. The mortgage deduction provision is meant to increase home ownership, not yacht ownership. There are as many as 500,000 yachts in the U.S. that qualify for this exemption, and the yacht industry actually includes this tax loophole in their marketing. Now, the second loophole that, again, has been mentioned before on the floor is a tax break for racehorse owners. The current tax code allows racehorse owners to depreciate the cost of their horses at an accelerated rate. Yachts and racehorses. These are tax breaks that just don't make sense. We all know we're grappling with a truly historic long-term deficit. To continue to ignore the revenue side of that deficit is irresponsible. And our tax code is riddled with hundreds of arbitrary tax breaks, just like the one for racehorses, and the one for yachts. In fact, we give away more in tax breaks in a year than we take in through individual and corporate income taxes. These tax breaks are too often granted based on who has the most clout in Congress, rather than based on what's the best for the economy or what's fair for people in this country. And so the result is that some businesses are paying nearly the full corporate tax rate, while others are paying almost nothing. We need a fairer system. We need a tax system that drives innovation and that keeps our economy competitive on the global stage. Do we really want to continue supporting tax breaks for yachts and for racehorses? If we want to eliminate waste in government, isn't this exactly the kind of spending that we should be targeting? And last, we must consider the price of refusing to deal with these tax breaks, of refusing to say we're going to look at these kinds of tax breaks, because we know that meaningful deficit reform will mean trillions of dollars in changes. And in avoiding revenues, Republicans have instead proposed steep cuts that are dangerous both to the health of the American people and to the strength of our economy. Eliminating funding for basic women's health care, ending Medicare as we know it, dangerous cuts to nursing home care, slashing Pell Grants that will help train the next generation of engineers, stopping the development of new energy technologies, and halting efforts to retool the economy to compete in the 21st century. These are the alternatives that Republicans are proposing to save tax breaks for yachts and racehorses. Now, we know we need to continue these kinds of basic services and investments in the economy. The President's Bipartisan Commission has said it, the business community has said it, and Americans know it. We also know that finding a compromise on the debt limit is critical if we want to avoid plunging our economy back into chaos. And we know that many of these tax breaks just don't make sense. So I urge my colleagues, let's look at the facts. Let's work together for what we all know needs to happen. Reduce the deficit, raise the debt limit, and keep America working. Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I ask if Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island could follow me. I ask consent that Senator Reed be the next speaker on our side.
Is there objection? No objection, sort of.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I request permission to speak as in morning business. Are we in a quorum call, or?
We are in morning business. We are in morning business, and the senator is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the bills from a decade of ineffective tax cuts and unpaid wars and a recession fueled by lax regulation have come due. I did not support the policies that generated these bills, but pretending these bills don't have to be paid is not an option. Indeed, playing chicken, literally, with the full faith and credit of the United States government is a recipe for disaster. If the U.S. defaults on its debt, every single expert tells us it will have a huge and immediate impact on the lives of every American all across this country, from the poorest to the most well-off. and particularly for those who are struggling, it will be devastating at a time when they can least afford it. And not only could it cause a stoppage of Social Security and Veterans Benefits checks, but more systematically, it would undermine our nation's opportunity to build a more lasting and more prosperous recovery. We have seen some progress, but it's not enough. This step, if we default, would seriously undermine our ability to function as an economy and would seriously, perhaps decisively, affect our ability to mount and continue to mount a reasonable recovery. We are still recovering from the worst depression since the 1930s, many of it based on the policies that I mentioned previously. 2 unfunded wars, the expansion of an entitlement program that was unpaid for, deep tax cuts that were unpaid for, all of it put on the tab, and the tab is coming due. But now to suggest that we walk away from our obligation to provide at least the legal means to pay our debts is, I think, irresponsible. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle like to talk about taking a scalpel to wasteful spending and about the primacy of severely curtailing investments in our society. They continue to talk about an economic philosophy that I think has been disproven by the last several years, particularly from 2000, when President Bush and a Republican Congress inherited a projected multi-trillion-dollar surplus and turned it into a huge deficit under the premise that these types of cuts in taxes, these types of policies would stimulate jobs. In fact, there's been talk that they were now focusing on cutting spending on Medicare and Medicaid, which is so central to all Americans. It's difficult also to imagine that they're asking for these cuts at a time when so many families throughout this country are struggling to stay in their homes, struggling simply to pay the bills each week, struggling to ensure that their children can continue on to education. All of this needs a government that supports these Americans, not reneges on commitments we've made, particularly commitments we've made financially to essentially pay for the obligations that have been run up, particularly beginning in 2000 and continuing through the Bush administration. Now, we all understand that we have to reach a principled compromise. But in that compromise, as so many of my colleagues have suggested, an exclusive focus on cutting expenditures will not get us there, I think, simply based on the arithmetic. But more than that, it will impose huge burdens on families that are struggling, and it will continue to reward the most prosperous in this nation. That, I don't think, is the right way to do it or the fair way to do it. The priorities that I've heard expressed on the other side is continue to talk about very deep tax cuts at a time when we have the lowest revenues we've had in decades, and then talk about cutting expenditures, education, health care, and indeed, under their proposed budget, Medicare and Medicaid, which is so central to so many people. We know that we have to focus on not just expenditures, but also revenues. And we also have to begin the very difficult and arduous task of entitlement reform. We began that in the last Congress. In fact, I think it is ironic, as I recall the debate on the Affordable Care Act, that most of the amendments that my colleagues on the other side were offering were to send back to committee proposed changes in Medicare that would have reduced costs and, I would argue, would actually improve quality. That was their focus. And now their focus has suddenly shifted to, oh, we must cut Medicare. We must cut Medicaid. What we have to do is, I think, provide the same kind of reasonable, balanced approach that took place in the 1990s, again, without any Republican support in 1993 and 94, but with Democratic president and Democratic votes, we were able to begin to balance the budget. It was a multi-year process. It required difficult choices, but we have to continue to pursue that path of balanced, reasonable response to this problem. Now, as I said before, one of the issues that is so central to this country is not directly related just to the issue of the deficit. It's also related to jobs. They are obviously closely interrelated. The more jobs we have, the more people that are participating in the economy, the better our fiscal position is in Washington. And sadly, what we saw, particularly at the tail end of the Bush administration, is a collapse in our jobs market. And the U.S. economy lost 8.7 million private sector jobs in 2008 and 2009. We experienced, under the Bush administration, principally 25 consecutive months of job losses. And that, again, has contributed to these huge deficits. People don't work. They don't contribute to the tax system. People don't work. They get unemployment benefits. The people who lose part of their wages qualify for other programs. Now, since the President has come to office, we have seen a rebound. We have not seen the full, robust recovery we need, but we've seen a rebound. We gained 2.081 million jobs, a little over 2 million jobs in 2010 and 2011. And we've experienced 15 consecutive months of private sector job creation. Not enough, but we reversed the collapse and 25 months of job decline by creating jobs and continuing on a sustained basis. And as a result of difficult decisions that were made by President Obama and a Democratic Congress in the Recovery Act. Now, my home state of Rhode Island has been particularly hard hit by the policies that we saw in the first part of this decade. Third highest unemployment rate at 10.9%. We've seen foreclosure problems. We have seen very, very crippling impacts on the working families of Rhode Island. But now we hear that the only solution we have and the best way to correct jobs is to continue to do what was done under the Bush administration. Let's just cut taxes, particularly for the wealthiest Americans. Now, the evidence suggests that that doesn't produce the kind of jobs, not even the kind of jobs we've seen in the last 15 months. The economy did not add a single new job during the 3 years under the Bush tax cuts. The economy had 132 million jobs in June of 2001 when we passed, against my opposition, the Bush tax cut. That was the month it was first signed into law. 3 years later, in June of 2004, there were just 131.4 million jobs. We actually lost some jobs. If you take a step back and look at the course of the entire Bush presidency, from January 2001 through January 2009, there was a decline in the number of private sector jobs of approximately 650,000. That's over the course of the whole administration. In fact, the only net job creation that occurred was in the public sector. Nearly 1.75 million government jobs were created over the course of the Bush presidency. Revenue, as a percentage of our economy, as a percentage of GDP, was 14% in 2010. It's the lowest level since 1950 when it dropped to 14.4%. By comparison, government revenue was averaging about 18% over the previous 30 years. So you see, under Bush policies, which essentially my colleagues want to emulate, reconstitute, no job growth, and a significant decline in revenue. At a time when revenue as a percentage of GDP is the lowest it's been in 60 years, now we're talking about further tax cuts in the Ryan budget, but we're certainly talking, and my colleagues are talking about, maintaining the current tax system. And frankly, there are so many tax expenditures that my colleagues have talked about that are not worthy of retention, that are loopholes that we can, in fact, eliminate, and we should. Some examples: tax breaks for people who breed alpacas, deductions for film and TV production, favorable tax depreciation for racehorse owners, horse breeders, exemption for wooden practice arrows used by children, NASCAR motorsports racing facility tax credit, and withholding tax breaks on horse and dog track winnings. And the list could go on and on and on.
The senator has used his 10 minutes.
Mr. President, I would request minutes for one additional minute.
Without objection.
Thank you, and I thank the gentleman, the senator from Illinois, for his deference. We understand that we have to make tough choices. They have to include expenditure cuts, and we've already started with the continuing resolution for last year where we reduced spending significantly. But we have to have revenue on the table. As Federal Reserve Chairman Bernanke said, a sharp fiscal consolidation focused on the very near term could be self-defeating if it were to undercut the still fragile recovery. We need to create jobs. We need to balance deficit reduction with job creation. We need to put everything on the table. And we need to recognize that the consequences of default on our debt will be staggering, felt by every American. One figure that continues to be impressed upon me is the fact that for every 1% increase in the interest rate over the 10-year period, we increase our deficit by over $1 trillion. And I think the first response to a default would be a rise in interest rates that we have to pay for our debt. So, Mr. President, I would urge progress on the efforts to have a comprehensive solution, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, I ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
The Senate is in morning business. The senator is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. President, beyond the debt limit extension, which has consumed rightly the attention of this body, we face another challenge, and that is funding for our roads, our airports, and our railroads. Our best estimate is that current needs would total $225 billion annually. But revenue from the main source of funding for these programs, the gasoline tax, only totals $90 billion. The law requires balance in the Transportation Trust Fund. And so how would we respond? There are basically three major options. Option one, let funding fall. But this would be a catastrophe, especially for the construction industry. We're already in my home state of Illinois, upwards of 30% of construction workers are without work. Option two, increase the gas tax. But that is one of the most regressive taxes that hits the working poor harder than almost any other citizen in our country. And the slowdown in our economy as a result of a gas tax increase would probably cause unemployment to go up and could jeopardize our extremely fragile recovery. There is a third option. But before I describe the third option, let me ask a question. Arguably, what is the third biggest thing that the Lincoln administration was known for? First would be the Emancipation Proclamation. Second would be the victory in the Civil War. But what's number three? I would argue it was the 1862 Transcontinental Railway Act, enacted in 1862 when the Lincoln administration was borrowing as much money as it could from as many creditors as possible to fund the expansion of the Union Army. With credit already stretching to the limit, and does this sound familiar, the Lincoln administration launched the largest infrastructure development program in the history of the United States. We built a 2,000-mile railroad in only 6 years and created 7,000 American towns. And we did it with only $50 million in appropriations. How did we fund the rest? And the answer was, this was the ultimate public-private partnership. I'm particularly worried in this Congress, especially as it considers a transportation bill next year. Have we forgotten our own economic legacy, especially from the time that we built one of the largest infrastructure development projects in history? To recall, the federal government granted 20 square miles of alternating sections on either side of the railroad for every mile or track they laid to those railroads. Railroads were also granted timber, stone, and mineral rights in land. In addition, for every mile of track they laid, the railroads were authorized to issue a set amount of bonds, loans that they received, with interest payments backed by the federal government. This guaranteed 30-year bonds to be issued at a low rate of 6%. This is one of the largest development projects in the history of the United States. And that's why I think it is an example for how we respond to our transportation needs today. When we look at our own economic legacy and we look at the funding shortfall for new roads, new airports, and new rail, I think we should recover that legacy to respond to the challenge for next year. And that's why I've introduced the Lincoln Legacy Infrastructure Development Act. This legislation removes a number of federal restrictions on public-private partnerships, providing states greater flexibility to generate transportation revenues and enhance access to private capital for road, rail, aviation, transit, and port infrastructure. Under the Lincoln Legacy Infrastructure Development Act, we could mobilize over $100 billion for new infrastructure investment. Now, specifically, this legislation lifts caps on cost recovery programs for highways. It incentivizes partnerships in transit. It removes barriers to airport privatization. It increases resources for the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, sometimes called TIFIA, and makes improvements in the Railroad Rehabilitation and Improvement Financing Program, which are backed by the High-Speed Rail Association and the American High-Speed Rail Association. The legislation also stands on the premise that the taxpayer should be protected in these types of arrangements. Indiana showed us what a properly structured deal would look like. Governor Mitch Daniels reaped a windfall from the 2006 lease of the Indiana Toll Road that netted his state $3.8 billion for new transportation upgrades. Most of the money has now been reinvested in highway projects throughout his state, and leaders shrewdly placed $500 million in an interest-bearing account to fund future road projects. This is one of the many reasons why the Indiana economy has grown at twice the rate of the Illinois economy. Now, we have seen public-private partnerships take off not in our own country, where they were almost invented, but in other countries, especially British Columbia and Australia, where they have mobilized over $30 billion for new transportation infrastructure, almost 20% of their total, using this innovative financing means. In these times of deficit and debt, we could let America grind to a halt. We could raise taxes and sock it to the working poor. We could slow down our economy with a new government burden. Or we could recall our own economic legacy, written by Abraham Lincoln's administration itself, to use public-private partnerships as a way of growing jobs and incomes in the United States without increasing taxes. I would urge this body to review this legislation as we come up with a new transportation bill and to see it as a way to improve jobs, incomes, and our infrastructure, so critical to the crossroads of the nation, Illinois, and doing it in a way that doesn't hurt our economy or the working poor. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back.
Senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, we must raise the debt ceiling, period. Now, this is not an opinion, it's a fact. The consequences of failing to act are simply too catastrophic to consider any other course. Negotiations are now underway seeking an agreement to raise the debt ceiling as part of a larger agreement on deficit reduction. But there's a major obstacle to agreement, a refusal on the part of the Republican leadership to compromise, a refusal to understand that sacrifice must be shared. The sacrifice, they say, must come from middle America, those struggling to pay for a college education or for health care for their kids or long-term care for their parents. The Republican leaders demand that this sacrifice be made by the middle class in order to push tax cuts and other tax breaks for the wealthiest among us, despite the huge and growing gap in the distribution of income in our country between the wealthy and the middle class. Now, just one example of the kind of tax breaks and tax loopholes that we Democrats seek to change is the unconscionable tax break given to hedge fund managers. Hedge fund managers generally make their money by charging their clients two fees. First, the manager receives a management fee, typically equal to 2% of the assets invested. Second, the manager typically receives 20% of the income from those investments above a certain level. This 20% share of the investment returns from hedge funds is known as carried interest. Under current law, most hedge fund managers claim that this carried interest qualifies as a long-term capital gain, currently subject to a maximum tax rate of 15%, rather than being taxed as ordinary income, currently subject to a maximum tax rate of 35%. But a moment's analysis shows that this money is not ordinary income by any fair definition and should be treated that way. The 20% fee is not capital gains because it applies not to capital that the hedge fund manager is invested, but to the payment he receives for investing capital that other people provide. Pretending that the 20% fee is capital gains, when in fact it is payment for a service, is an Alice in Wonderland argument that elevates fiction over fact. Now, we Democrats seek to end this fiction. We are ready to call carried interest what it is: ordinary taxable income. Recognizing carried interest for what it is would increase tax fairness for working Americans who pay their share and their fair share of taxes. They have the right to expect that the wealthy do the same, and it would reduce the deficit if we did this by an estimated $21 billion. Republicans seek to protect this loophole. They say the income of investment managers is at risk from year to year and therefore deserving of a lower tax rate. Well, Mr. President, ask the factory worker who just saw his or her job move overseas. Ask the store clerk who saw his employer close because of the damage from the financial crisis. Ask the part-time worker whose hours and earnings go up and down from week to week. Ask all of them just how much risk working Americans face right now. Now, Republicans say taxing this income as ordinary income would discourage investment in job creation, and that's absurd. The people who are actually risking their capital, investors in these funds, will continue to see their profits taxed at the lower capital gains rate. The issue in this case is income that these managers receive for serving their clients. If you're a hedge fund manager, your job is to manage a hedge fund. The income you receive for that job is no different than the income a waitress receives for waiting tables or a janitor receives for scrubbing floors. The idea that the income of millionaire fund managers should be taxed at a lower rate than that of their staff or of other workers is an absurdity. And this nonsensical loophole is deeply unfair at a time when working families are struggling while the wealthiest among us continue to prosper greatly. Recent decades have seen a massive and growing prosperity gap between ordinary Americans and the wealthy. How wide has that gap become? In 1980, the top 1% of American earners took home about 10% of our nation's total income. Just a few decades later, that figure had increased to 24% of our nation's total income. And that's just the wealthiest 1% that have now over 20% of our total income. It's hard to argue that properly taxing their income will impose great hardship on investment fund managers who have done awfully well in recent years. Now, how well have those investment fund managers done? According to a survey by a magazine covering the hedge fund industry, the top 25 hedge fund managers earned $22.7 billion last year. The two managers atop the list earned $8 billion each. Now, that's billion with a B. Well, the typical American household earned perhaps $60,000 or $62,000 in 2008. Those hedge fund managers earned in about 4 minutes what it took a typical working family a year to earn. Yet they pay drastically lower rates on those massive incomes than the low-wage workers who clean their offices. Now, the Republicans would protect these unconscionable tax breaks while at the same time wanting to cut programs which provide an education for our kids, provide health care for our seniors. It gets worse. Adding insult to injury, Republicans are protecting another tax loophole, one that many of these hedge fund managers, by the way, use to avoid taxes entirely. This loophole allows corporations and wealthy individuals to take income earned here and shift it to overseas tax havens, dodging the U.S. taxes that they rightly owe. I've long sought to end this abuse because these offshore tax havens increase the tax burden on those who pay the taxes they owe. In the last Congress, I introduced the Stop Tax Haven Abuse Act, which would seek to recover tax revenue now lost to offshore tax dodging. Ending this loophole is significant if we seek to properly tax the income of hedge fund managers. In one hearing of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, which I chair, 3 well-known hedge funds that claim to be based in the Cayman Islands admitted under questioning that they did not have a single employee in the Cayman Islands. Closing the offshore loophole would make our effort to equitably tax carried interest all the more effective by shutting off a major avenue that hedge funds and other investment funds use to dodge taxes. Democrats have rightly proposed addressing the carried interest loophole and offshore tax havens and other unfair tax loopholes as part of a balanced deficit reduction strategy. We believe that it is grossly unfair to cut programs that help young Americans get a college education or help train working Americans for new jobs in order to protect tax loopholes that benefit the wealthiest Americans. The Republican response? To walk out of negotiations and say that they will not accept any deficit reduction package if it includes revenue measures. Mr. President, what is the time situation?